The U.S. versus John Lennon movie review. So this is a documentary that came out back in 2006, and the documentary is about John Lennon's political activism, and in particular kind of his fight against getting deported from the U.S. because of his political activism. Now, I hate to be the guy who says, "Oh, I knew it all already before I saw the documentary," but in this case I'm going to be that guy. I knew all of this already, long before I saw the documentary. I was obsessed with John Lennon. When I was in high school and college, I was kind of a big classic rock fan in general, and I was interested in the Beatles, and I was interested in the political activism of the time. I pretty much knew all this stuff. There are whole books written about this, and I don't actually remember the names, but I remember being in the college library and kind of in the pop culture history section, the music history section, and coming across these books just devoted to John Lennon's kind of years of political activism. I say years in the sense that it was only a few years. He went through this phase of being politically active, and then he kind of went out of it. There are whole books about his kind of alliances and attempts by political people to manipulate him, and his kind of attempts to do kind of what he was wanting to do. I actually sat down and read one of these books, checked it out of the library. It was 20 years ago at this stage, so the book itself I only remember in bits and pieces, but I do remember kind of sitting on a Friday night in the dorm rooms reading it, and everybody else is going out to parties, and I was thinking to myself, boy, I am really a geek. Here I am reading this book about John Lennon instead of going out and having fun. I just got so absorbed in it at the time. Also, VH1, the cable channel, used to kind of rerun a lot of these archival programs back in the 90s. I don't know if they still do that or not. I've kind of lost touch in the years since I've been living in Asia. In fact, I don't even know if VH1 still exists anymore. I don't know. But anyways, in the 90s, they would occasionally rerun some of these shows. For example, the famous Dick Cavett interview with John Lennon. VHS used to rerun that in their entirety. I was a big enough fan that I videotaped it off the TV when it was on, and then used to rewatch it periodically. Also, the Mike Douglas show was another thing they used to rerun. So this was, I don't remember, this was 1970 or 1971 or something. Mike Douglas, who had like a daytime talk show, had worked out this deal with John Lennon where John Lennon took over the show for a whole week. So it's like 5 hours of John Lennon hosting the Mike Douglas show. And he had all his radical friends on. So he had Bobby Seale, the co-founder of the Black Panthers, was on for one episode. And Jerry Rubin, who was one of the... he was co-founder of the Yippie movement. If that doesn't mean anything to you, he was just like a famous hippie back in the day. Hippie/political activist. The VH1 actually used to kind of show all 5 hours of this. I watched it, videotaped it, rewatched it. Not to mention kind of all the other Beatles documentaries and John Lennon's documentaries, which I just was a huge fan of back in the day. So yeah, you can imagine when this particular documentary came out, I was super excited about it. And then kind of went to see it and was just like, yeah, I know that, I've seen that clip before, I've seen that clip before. What are you gonna do, huh? It was well put together for whatever it was worth. And by the time this documentary came out in 2006, I was already 28 at the time. So I was already even kind of growing out growing out of that stage where you're obsessed with kind of pop music stars. But that's just me. So, I mean, imagine there's somebody in this world who's 16, 17, sees this movie for the first time, has very little idea of the whole history about it. You know, you can imagine this would be kind of a very radicalizing experience to see this movie, and you know, we all start somewhere. In fact, there's a copy of this movie on YouTube, I think probably illegally, like I think it's probably in violation of the copyright, but whatever. It's on there at the moment. I was looking through the comments section of it, and people were saying, oh wow, this is so amazing, no idea, stuff like that. And the movie, you know, it's primarily framed around John Lennon, but it uses John Lennon's life as a jumping off point to talk about some things like COINTEL and the assassination of Fred Hampton, and the Kent State Massacre. Did I say that one already? Vietnam War, just kind of all this kind of other things. Black Panther Party, and the Richard Nixon and kind of the shady stuff his government was doing. So, you know, if you're a young person and you're new to this, and they don't teach a lot of this in schools, right? Yeah, you can imagine this documentary could be quite formative for somebody if they hit them at the right point. I was 28 when I saw it, and I kind of knew all of it already. But yeah, it was well put together. The jumping off for a moment to kind of talk not so much about the documentary, but the phenomenon itself, the thing itself. Yeah, it's a fascinating little period in pop culture history, this John Lennon thing, right? And it was admittedly only for a couple of years, because John Lennon kind of went through phases. So he was really political for a few years, and then he just kind of dropped it completely, a little by about, I don't know, 73 or 74 or something like that. Now, part of this was, as they show in the documentary, part of it he dropped it because he was exhausted, and the Nixon administration had made his life hell, and he was just trying to kind of keep his family together and stuff like that. You know, the other reason he dropped it could be because he just kind of went through phases, and I think he went through a hedonistic phase after this, right? It was the Lost Weekend happened after his political activism stage faded. Am I getting that right? But anyways, for what it was a fascinating little moment in pop culture history, because, you know, at the risk of regurgitating cliches, you don't get bigger than the Beatles. I mean, there was no band that was bigger than this. So imagine whatever kind of band is really huge right now. I don't know, like K-pop, BTS, or what do the kids listen to nowadays? I'm out of touch, but whatever the huge boy band is nowadays, imagine if like the lead singer of that just got really into radical politics, and like really radical politics. I mean, you know, Bobby Seale and the Black Panthers, that, you know, that was something that really scared middle-class America at the time. Jerry Rubin, Tariq Ali, who was featured quite prominently in this documentary talking about John Lennon. I actually recently I reviewed his book, his autobiography, which I'll link to that down below, my review of Tariq Ali's autobiography. In that book, Tariq Ali really kind of highlights his connection with a number of celebrities, John Lennon included. As I mentioned in my review, I got the impression that he was putting it on a little bit, like kind of over-highlighting his connection to all these celebrities, but who knows, you know, taking him at his word, maybe he was kind of quite a close personal friend of John Lennon, as he kind of claims to be in his autobiography. So it is kind of, you can't really get more radical than that. So it's just an interesting little moment in pop culture history. I wonder, I kind of talk about this as if it was like a strange little thing that happened, but I'm kind of thinking out loud here as I'm talking. But I wonder if one of the reasons this really hasn't happened since then, one of the reasons we don't have like NSYNC or the boy bands from today kind of embracing radical politics, is because corporations just would not let this happen again, right? Anything that gets in the pop charts nowadays is just so controlled by corporations, and there's a whole machinery of it and stuff like that. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud. But yeah, it was kind of an interesting little episode in history. It also, if you're going to push this a little bit, maybe creates an interesting question, I guess, about the intersection between rock music and celebrity and kind of real politics. So, like, the danger is misremembering the 1960s as kind of this era of kind of rock bands, like the Grateful Dead, the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Woodstock, and just remembering it as kind of this time when protest music and rock bands were really radical and rocking and kind of all this stuff, which is completely misrepresentation of the actual history, because the actual history was there was a lot of radical stuff going on in kind of the civil rights movement and kind of the black communities and the college campuses and the anti-war activism, and the rock bands were reacting to that. So if you kind of recreate the history of the 60s as a history of just kind of these rock bands, you're misrepresenting what actually happened. Now this kind of misrepresentation happens all the time. To be fair to this particular documentary, the US versus John Lennon, they did portray John Lennon as kind of reacting to what was going on. And they did kind of portray that there were people like Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman who were trying to manipulate John Lennon and trying to push him further in different directions. This comes through a little bit in the documentary, but depending on what books you read or something like that, there are some authors who say that Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman took advantage of John Lennon's political naivete to really push him and manipulate him into promoting their own causes. I don't know. But yeah, certainly in the US versus John Lennon documentary, they talk about how Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman really wanted John Lennon at their 1972 protest against the Republican convention. And this was the point where John Lennon and Yoko Ono finally pushed back and said, no, we're not doing that. Yeah, I guess, while we're on the subject, Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman themselves were kind of playing the celebrity game. So these were kind of people who had been made into kind of media celebrities by the television cameras because they were able to, they were charismatic and they were verbally eloquent and able to kind of, get behind a microphone and appeal to the cameras. And so they were kind of mini celebrities in themselves. Arguably, I'm probably going to get in trouble for this a little bit, but arguably Bobby Seale was somewhat the same way. I mean, there was kind of the Black Panther Party was somewhat of a media creation, or at least the extent maybe to which it kind of played into people's televisions was partially created by the media. Or I don't know, maybe that's going too far. So it's a little bit kind of unfair to kind of blame this all on the rock bands. There was this whole kind of celebrity culture here, which was a little bit arguably divorced from the grassroots and kind of what was going on in the community level or at the campus level. There's a tendency when you're 19, and I'm guilty of this as much as anybody when I was this age, to kind of think that the political activism comes from these musicians. Like Rage Against the Machine was really big when I was kind of in high school and college. And I remember at one point kind of, you know, you're kind of rocking out to it and you're like, yeah, these guys get it. And there was a penny dropping moment somewhere around the time when I was 19 or something, when I was kind of listening to the lyrics and I was thinking, you know, this actually isn't all that deep. Like, these guys really aren't any more politically sophisticated than I am. The difference is that they're talented musicians, so they're able to set it to music. And music does strange things to us. I mean, this is kind of a whole different topic for another video, and I don't know what I'm talking about really. But you know, when you're listening to something set to music, it feels deeper than it really is, because music kind of strikes something in us and it kind of moves us in some way. Which is why protest music is so powerful. Not really because the words themselves are so meaningful, but because it, you know, the music creates that connection with you, and it moves you, and it gets you really emotional, doesn't it? So obviously, protest music is powerful, and John Lennon's music was quite powerful in that way. Although actually, I'm going to go on a different tangent here. There's another question of how good John Lennon's protest music was. So I think most of John Lennon's protest music comes from one album called Sometime in New York City. I actually love this album, but it's not without its flaws. And when people talk about John Lennon's political activism, unless you're a real kind of geek like I am, you know, like a music history, pop culture geek or something like that, you know, the average person, it's hard for them to name a lot of the songs John Lennon actually did. I mean, there's Give Peace a Chance, and maybe they know Merry Christmas, War is Over. But the Sometime in New York City album was like John Lennon wanted to be like the next Bob Dylan. And very few of those songs have kind of withstood the test of time in terms of being remembered in the pop culture memory, the way Bob Dylan songs or Peter, Paul and Mary songs or, you know, Woody Guthrie songs or those protest songs have endured. Now I'm a big fan, so I'm kind of judge these songs forgivingly. But, you know, people who are music critics will kind of tear into these songs a little bit and say the rhythm and the beat and the rhyming and the way the lyrics fit the meter is kind of all wrong, and yeah, maybe it is a bit. I mean, I really like the songs because I'm a John Lennon fan, and I was really into political activism when I was younger, so like singing along with them. Anyways, one of the things I remember, when this movie first came out in 2006, I was living in the US at that time. And I was heavily involved with local activist organizations. Like, I would attend kind of several meetings a week of local activist organizations and various kind of little mini protests and stuff like that. And as anybody who's ever been involved in local activism knows, it is incredibly hard to just get any kind of momentum going. You know, you show up to these meetings and there's like 4 people there, and you plan these protests and nobody shows up, and it's just so hard to get stuff going. But then, you know, these protest music like Rage Against the Machine or John Lennon or Bob Dylan or whatever is hip now, I'm completely out of it nowadays, but I'm sure there's some sort of underground protest music scene going on now, you know, where there's anti-establishment songs and kind of anti-government songs, you go to a college campus and these kind of stickers for these bands are everywhere, and people have all these political slogans. So people really dig kind of rocking out to this music for kind of political protest music, which is good, but very often, that should be the starting point, and very often that's the ending point, because then when you actually try to go to these meetings or kind of these political organizing meetings, there's just 3 people there. So that's the danger of kind of mythologizing too much somebody like John Lennon, because you're like, listen to this music and you're being politically active, and then you're on the right side of history or something like that. Before I get too self-righteous, I should add that I haven't been to a protest or a political meeting in years. A lot of that is because I'm living abroad. Actually, that's the primary reason, is I'm living abroad. But also I'm just way too busy now. Even if I was, living in a place that was even if I was living back home, if I was living back home and had the kind of schedule I do now, I wouldn't be politically active back home either. Which is what happens, isn't it? That's how they get you. You get busy working 60 hours a week, and then you don't have time to get politically involved. I don't know. That's a separate message for a separate video. But yeah, I mean that is the danger here about overly romanticizing rock stars' involvement in politics. And it's interesting watching this video, is they have all these political activists, like real political activists, like Tariq Ali, Angela Davis, Bobby Seale. Jerry Rubin was dead by the time they made this documentary. I think he got killed sometime in the 1980s jaywalking. Although he had kind of sold out and become a businessman years before that. Jerry Rubin is a fascinating character, but he's a different subject for a different video. But all these people to kind of talk about John Lennon, and I don't know, like why, this is where it gets me a little bit. Why have Bobby Seale on as a supporting analyst to talk about John Lennon? Why not make a documentary about Bobby Seale? Or why have Angela Davis on to talk about John, kind of all these characters? You can go through the list. Why not have the focus be on Angela Davis of the Black Panther Party? Or, that Noam Chomsky, they actually get Noam Chomsky on. And, it's always good to see Chomsky. Now, what's interesting is, somebody correct me if I get this wrong, but I don't think Noam Chomsky ever says the words John Lennon once. I don't know how these interviews went. I don't know if Noam Chomsky even knew he was being interviewed for a John Lennon documentary. Noam Chomsky talks about Nixon's bombing of Cambodia. He talks about COINTEL and the FBI. He talks about the young people getting involved in the anti-war movement. As far as memory serves, Noam Chomsky is interviewed only so far as to provide the political background for what John Lennon was doing. Which is probably just as well. I mean, what does Noam Chomsky know about John Lennon? But, yeah. I don't know, it would have been interesting just to hear Chomsky's perspective on the relationship between star power and Lennon and stuff like that. Gore Vidal, they get Gore Vidal on as another. Of course, Gore Vidal is another celebrity, right? So, I mean, arguably Chomsky is a celebrity. I'm talking in circles, and part of the reason I'm talking in circles is because I don't know where this is going. Like, I don't know what the conclusion to all this is. These are just the issues that go through my mind while I watch the documentary. So I'll just finish here. In short, it was an interesting documentary, and I recommend it. If you're a big Beatles fan like I am, you probably know all this already, but it's You know, the point of a documentary is sometimes not to see new information. It's just kind of to see the presentation and the narrative of information you already know. And if you don't already know this, oh boy, this is going to be interesting for you.